In the Silmarillion, we get a short essay of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. When you watch the first Lord of the Rings movie, that part where Isildur chops off Sauron's fingers, if you ever said to yourself you wanted to know more about this and a little before and after of the Rings of Power and the Third Age is something you will want to read. We were all deceived. Maybe not intentionally, but if you're like me and you came to Tolkien's works from these movies, you probably thought there were only 20 rings. 9 for men, 7 for dwarves, 3 for elves, and 1 ring to rule them all. But this chunk of the Silmarillion tells a different tale. Now the elves made many rings, but secretly Sauron made 1 ring to rule all the others, and their power was bound up with it, to be subject wholly to it, and to last only so long as it too should last. A little later we get this. As soon as Sauron set the ring upon his finger, they were aware of him, and they knew him, and perceived that he would be master of them, and of all that they wrought. Then in anger and fear they took off their rings, but he, finding that he was betrayed and the elves were not deceived, was filled with wrath, and he came against them with open war. Elven smiths could not have attained to their making without his lore and counsel, but the elves fled from him, and 3 of their rings they saved, and bore them away, and hid them. That makes it sound like the elves had more than just 3 rings, doesn't it? They only saved 3 out of a larger number they were unable to save, right? Other than that, what we're told in the movies is what we're told here. 7 rings Sauron gave to the dwarves, and 9 he gave to men. These 9 men became mighty in their day, kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old. I always assumed these guys were already kings, and then the rings turned them into monsters, but this seems to imply they became mighty kings after receiving the rings from Sauron, which does add a sort of Old Testament Luciferian quality to Sauron. Listen to me and you'll become powerful. You won't die unless a woman stabs you. But if you asked what happened to the 7 rings the dwarves got, this article in the Silmarillion tells you. It is said that the foundation of each of the 7 hordes of the dwarf kings of old was a golden ring, but all those hordes long ago were plundered and the dragons devoured them, and of the 7 rings some were consumed in fire and some Sauron recovered. What I find interesting is Tolkien leaves it open that mayhap some of the rings are still unaccounted for. Some were consumed in fire, and some Sauron recovered. Circa the last meeting of the White Council, the same year as the events of The Hobbit, Gandalf says Sauron has 3 of the dwarven rings, leaving some to be consumed in fire, but not necessarily all of the other 4. But it is said, always a tricksy little phrase when you're writing a history of your fictional world. It leaves it open that something else might be going on other than what is being said. It is said that the foundation of each of the 7 hordes of the dwarf kings of old was a golden ring. Stop right there. Of the dragons mentioned in Tolkien's works, who is the dragon we know who took a hoard of gold? Smaug from The Hobbit. Tolkien was a linguist, so when he says the dragons devoured the hoards of gold, I don't think he means that literally. After all, Smaug had the gold in the Lonely Mountain for a good little while, maybe not that long in dragon time, but long enough for him to have devoured all this gold, and he didn't. So I think when this says the dragon devoured the hoards, it means this is mine, you can't have it. Which means, if it is true that the 7 dwarf holds were built on each of the 7 rings given to the dwarves, that it is likely that Smaug was sitting on one of the rings of power. I should clear some things up. Durin III was one of the dwarf kings when Sauron first handed out rings of power to the dwarves, and he lived at Khazad-dûm, later to be known as Moria. Smaug took over the Lonely Mountain, aka not Moria. But Thorin Oakenshield is the rightful king of Durin's folks, dwarves descended from and associated with Durin, the one who lived at Khazad-dûm. I guess it's possible Durin had gold holed up in more than one place, but the Silmarillion mentions these 7 hordes of the dwarf kings. With 7 rings, I don't think I'm alone in assuming 1 ring for each dwarf king, right? So each king would have 1 hoard of gold. So if the gold at the Lonely Mountain belongs to Thorin, who is the rightful king of Durin's folks, then this should be Durin's hoard of gold. So and I concede this is a big if one of the dwarven rings of power was at the Lonely Mountain, what happened to it? Bard of Lake Town kills Smaug, the battle of the 5 armies happens, Thorin dies, and the gold gets split up between the surviving dwarves, the people of Lake Town, Bilbo Baggins taking a little for himself. This is all supposition on my part, but I suspect that if there was a ring of power getting divvied up after the battle, that Sauron at this time, going by the name the Necromancer, would have gotten his hands on it. Sauron was living in Mirkwood, the realm of Thranduil, the king of the woodland elves, who participated in the battle of the 5 armies. We are told Thranduil held Sauron at bay, but he still grew in power, becoming strong enough for all the races of Middle-earth to join forces to fight him again a few decades after Smaug was killed. If there was a ring of power, he definitely would have wanted it, to use it in the same way he used the ring centuries earlier. Gift it to someone you can later control. And we know there were men in Sauron's forces by the time we get to the Lord of the Rings. Mayhap a high-ranking commander in Sauron's army wears the ring that once sat in Smaug's treasure. Who knows?